Who were the first groups of Europeans to visit Minnesota? Why had they come, and what did they hope to gain? Essentially, the first groups of Europeans to visit Minnesota were all French. The French had established presence in what is modern-day Canada since about the 1500s or so. And they had, in that case, engaged with a lot of trade and exchange with American Indian groups on the East Coast, the Iroquois, for example. So when eventually they keep exploring farther and farther inland, they're going to try to replicate those kind of relationships that they had been establishing. They realized that in the location that they had set up their colonies, that there weren't a lot of resources like gold, for example, that the Spanish were finding down in South America. There wasn't great farmland like the British were finding in their colonies. But what they did realize is that if they could make friendly, mutually beneficial relationships with American Indian groups, that the American Indians could trade them a lot of goods that they were seeking. In particular, they were looking for furs, which they were able to then process back into Europe, turn into clothing items, hats, and whatnot. And in that way, they were able to still sort of take advantage of turning the resources from the Americas into sort of profit for the French crown and the French kingdom. So these relationships had already been established with the American Indian groups on the East Coast, but they wanted to certainly extend their networks further and further inland. And the first sort of efforts to do that really come with some very early explorers. Pierre Espiert Radisson, for example, with the 1659 expedition, was one of the first Europeans to explore Lake Superior. He made his way into the territory of Wisconsin, eventually what is eventually going to be Minnesota. He might have reached as far as Mille Lacs, for example. His sort of initial expedition was followed up by Duluth in 1678. Of course, there's still a city named for Duluth today, as he sort of leads the first official expedition from the French into the Great Lakes region. And at that point in time, he quote-unquote claims all lands for the French crown, which is essentially meaningless because the French didn't really control anything out there. It was still all, of course, the Dakota and the Ojibwe controlling everything. But it sort of shows you that even though the French are interested in these sort of trade networks, they're still trying to essentially claim land that in really no way, shape, or form belongs to them. And that's still going to sort of be a precedent that they're going to be following, that eventually the British are very much going to be following up on, and eventually the Americans as well once they gain their independence from the British. But Duluth very much sort of marks the first sort of official expedition. Along the way, though, he's going to run into some other explorers from Europe, particularly Father Louis Hennepin and his companions, who had set out more overland to explore the northern Mississippi. They were captured by a Dakota group, and just sort of spent some time with them. It's sort of up to debate how much of actual prisoners they were. It sort of seems they were more kind of like guests that just couldn't leave, if that makes sense, which I suppose is a prisoner, but it doesn't seem like they were being treated overly poorly by the Dakota. During his time there, it was, of course, Father Hennepin who decides to rename the falls in the upper Mississippi the St. Anthony Falls, which is eventually what it's going to become called by future Europeans in the region. Of course, it originally had a different name that the American Indians in the region would have given it. But those are some of the very earliest explorers to visit the area that's eventually going to become Minnesota and start making those initial contacts with the Ojibwe and the Dakota. And eventually it's going to be followed up by fur traders who are going to be trying to establish much more permanent trading relationships with those groups. And that's what we're going to be describing in the upcoming questions here. Describe the fur trade in Minnesota. What roles did both American Indians and Europeans play? In what ways did the fur trade change over time? So of course, trade between American Indian groups across the waters and the Great Lakes had been going on for centuries before the arrival of Europeans. And the French really in particular were trying to sort of take those trade networks which all had already existed and just kind of trying to insert themselves in there and use those to their benefit in order to sort of get the trade goods that they were looking for. The majority of the furs, of course, were coming from the Dakota and the Ojibwe. They were the ones who were going out actively hunting and trapping the animals. We remember we read about last week how quite oftentimes it was women who were in charge of skinning and curing those hides, and then quite oftentimes also being the ones who would bring them in to do the negotiating and the trading. The French traders, for their part, as long sort of the traders and their crews, sometimes known as voyageurs, would travel via canoe across the Great Lakes, sort of from the more towards the East Coast. There's a huge sort of fur trading fort in Michigan, Fort Michilimackinac, that they would very much sort of utilize as kind of a middle way point. And from there, they'd continue west until they reached into Lake Superior and eventually into sort of the Great Lakes, western Great Lakes region, and including Wisconsin and Minnesota. Um, and oftentimes their destination would be specific trading posts that they were looking for. They weren't just trying to randomly find groups of American Indians to trade with. There were sort of set points, such as Grand Portage or the Kettle River, where these sort of exchanges between American Indians and voyageurs would take place. For their part, the American Indians would receive things like blankets or firearms, metal tools, kettles, a lot of things to sort of increase and improve the quality of life. Was primarily what they were looking for. The French, for their part, would then transport the furs back east to those sort of middle ground points, and then typically another crew would sort of take over to bring the furs all the way back to the coast. Eventually, they'd be put on ships in Montreal, Quebec, and they'd be shipped back to France. Another good point that a lot of people brought up is that a lot of times the American Indians would sort of get these trade goods on credit that they would sort of get in the wintertime that would help them through the winter. That's when they do a lot of the trapping and hunting, and then in the spring they'd sort of pay for those goods with their goods. And throughout time, this is going to start becoming somewhat of a problem because you definitely see a transition as the fur trade progresses over its sort of over 200-year history. Of course, the initial traders were French, but of course, with the French and the British and their rivalry, eventually there's going to be the 7 Years' War in the 1700s. The British are going to be victorious in that conflict, and the French are essentially going to have to cede all of what's going to be Canada, all their North American colonies in the sort of northern portions, to the British. And for a while, then the British are going to be taking over the fur trade, and they essentially are going to try to just do this exact same thing that the French were going to do. They try to sort of insert themselves in as the primary contact and the primary traders with the American Indians, and quite often the people who they're going to be using are going to be the same people. So a lot of the voyageurs are going to remain speaking French. Some of them are probably eventually going to be sort of bilingual, speaking British and French. But there's going to be sort of a very sort of strong cultural mixing, particularly when you start adding in the fact that a lot of the voyageurs are going to be marrying into American Indian tribes, and we'll be talking more about that in a few questions here. But the fur trade in general becomes sort of a very diverse trade network. And eventually the sort of last inheritor of the fur trade in the area that's going to be Minnesota is, of course, the American Fur Company. Once the United States is victorious in the Revolutionary War, they break off from Great Britain. They now want to be the ones taking over trading with the Dakota and the Ojibwe in Minnesota, and are going to try very hard to sort of keep the British out. As time goes on, you're also going to sort of see a decline in the fur trade. The furs are becoming a little bit less available and ready. The fashions are changing in Europe, so the price for these furs is going down. And this is unfortunately going to be coinciding right when there's going to be increased pressure on American Indians for their land, as more and more Europeans are going to start coming into what's going to become the state of Minnesota once it becomes a territory and so forth. And this is going to lead to some very large economic problems for the Dakota and the Ojibwe. They would have been borrowing on credit for a while. They were going to be in debt to these fur traders, and there was going to be increased sort of pressure on them to give up sort of the traditional hunting lands that they had. And it's going to be harder and harder for these American Indian groups to sort of survive and sustain themselves in the way that they had prior to the contact period. We'll be learning more about that in the coming weeks here. But sort of the beginnings of that issue and the beginnings of that problem is definitely the decline in the fur trade at the end of our time period here today. Why was Grand Portage important, and what role did it play in the fur trade? First and foremost, it's really geography that sort of makes the Grand Portage region important. Sort of an 8.5 mile pathway that connects the Pigeon River with Lake Superior, circumventing essentially a large stretch along the Pigeon River that is just you can't navigate it. But that's a very important river for sort of connecting the sort of western waterways with Lake Superior. And really from uh, Grand Portage, you can get to waterways which are going to lead to sort of three major oceans and can sort of get everywhere you want to go. So it's a great focal point for the fur trade. Um, and of course, it's going to be on this path that you're going to have the voyagers having to, carry their canoes and their packs, sometimes weighing up to 90 pounds. They could be carrying two of those. So it's certainly going to be a trek still to to get across the Grand Portage, but certainly it's the only way you're going to get across because you can't take boats and canoes down those rapids. But also, it was a very well-known location because it had been an Ojibwe village before Europeans had shown up, and it was a very sort of central trading location for American Indian groups in the upper Great Lakes region. So once more, you can really see how when the French start entering into the fur trade, they're not just using these connections, but they're actually using the locations that had been utilized for trade by American Indian groups for quite a while before Europeans had ever shown up. Eventually, the Europeans are going to construct more sort of permanent settlements on the location, consisting of 16 wooden buildings. There are shops, private lodgings, a mess hall, a counting office, storehouses, a palisade. So you can still sort of go and see the recreation of it today. It's still a historical site, and it's pretty neat to see what it would have been like at this point in time. But certainly one of the largest trading posts which was ever developed in Minnesota and in the region. Another thing that sort of makes it noteworthy is that it's the location of the Great Rendezvous, which took place in early summer, usually in June, which was essentially sort of a 2-month celebration of feasting and dancing and socializing between various voyager groups, between voyagers and American Indians, where a lot of the sort of trading and business would get done. It really sort of showed that it was a very vibrant location that was very much sort of heavily prized by everyone involved in the fur trade. As time goes on, the fort is going to sort of decline, particularly after the Revolutionary War, when the United States essentially sort of claims that land for themselves. The British are just going to move up the coast to Thunder Bay. They're going to construct Fort William, and that's to a certain degree going to cut off Grand Portage from a lot of the business that they would have been receiving prior to this time period. And it's really going to be sort of in decline after that for the last 30, 40 years or so, when the fur trade really stops becoming a prevalent aspect. In what ways do George Bonga and the Métis people reveal Minnesota's multicultural history during the fur trade era? How is the mixing of people and cultures advantageous to both Europeans and American Indians? Yeah, and really, this idea of sort of the cultural mixing which occurred during the fur trade was very much still a callback to traditional American Indian trading practices. Kinship had been very, very important in American Indian trade groups, and it was very often for them to marry into each other's tribes, specifically to sort of form those family bonds, which would help with having people bridge the culture and the language. And make it so that if you were sort of family with another group, the idea being that you wouldn't want to cheat someone in your family, you'd have to sort of maintain a good relationship with them. So it was supposed to sort of strengthen those bonds that could then be the formation of not just sort of a familial bond between two groups, but also an economic bond. So from the Europeans' perspective, of course, this would gain them access potentially to the trade groups they want, but it would also give them a chance to have some companionship and a family when they were in the Americas. The women who would marry the voyagers or the fur traders, they'd gain access to more status within their groups potentially. They'd gain more access to resources and some companionship, for themselves. These were women who were, as far as we can tell, very willing to enter into these relationships. They weren't being, forced to by their groups, as far as we know, for the vast majority of them. So it definitely seemed like it was, in a lot of ways, a very sort of mutually beneficial relationship that they were entering into. The children, oftentimes, then, of these relationships would sort of form sort of a new culture themselves. The Métis people essentially just means a combination between European and American Indian ancestry. And as time goes on, they're going to perform very important roles as translators and interpreters. They're a lot of times going to be voyagers and trappers and traders themselves, and are very much going to form a incredibly important role in the fur trade and the early history of the state. Also, as time goes on, they're going to essentially sort of develop their own cultures, and music and food and language. And there's still plenty of people today, primarily more in sort of north of us in Canada, who are going to trace their ancestry back to being Métis and still consider themselves Métis to this day. The video that we watched about the ox carts was from a sort of Métis broadcast. For sort of Métis people explaining some of their history. Now they're eventually going to continue the fur trade using those big ox carts that would come down the Red River Valley that they trade to what's eventually going to become sort of the Twin Cities area. So they're going to have a very long history in the area of developing sort of their own culture as time goes on. You can really see sort of George Bonga and his father and his brother entering into this area as well. He was a very prominent black fur trader, even though he considers himself white. And that sort of shows you how sort of fluid this idea of race and culture was at this point in time. By white, he essentially meant that he was sort of more associated with a European background than he was with American Indian background. But he very much in his own right was a very successful fur trader, translator. He spoke French and English and Ojibwe. He had been educated in Montreal. And he served as a guide, an advocate for the Ojibwe. His name appears on a lot of the treaties. And really, he's going to see the transition of the fur trade as it sort of runs out of steam. He's still going to sort of find a way to, sort of support himself and try to support the people in his family and his tribe, the Ojibwe. And really, I think is a very good example of sort of how multicultural the region was during the fur trade era, where people could really much more freely move between sort of various cultural and ethnic identities, that they weren't necessarily locked into being just one thing or the other. And that the Métis and someone like George Bonga provides really good evidence of this. Unfortunately, as time goes on, this is very much going to be declining, as the majority of the state increasingly becomes of Euro-American ancestry and heritage and background. It's definitely going to be pushing those people who sort of maintain those various multicultural roles and identities more and more to the side, and it's going to become more sort of difficult for them to fit in with the emerging prevailing culture. And we'll be talking more about that in the coming weeks here as we see that transition as the state becomes primarily inhabited by American Indians and Métis people to primarily European Americans over about a 30-40 year period. So more of that next week, but it's interesting to think about what the state really looked like during this time period. Why were Fort Snelling and the St. Peter's Indian Agency constructed, and what role did they play in the fur trade? Well, construction of Fort Snelling and St. Peter's Indian Agency very much is a very sort of important location, not just for sort of the first established presence of European Americans in the region, but also because it was a very sort of sacred place for the Dakota. The location of Fort Snelling is at a location which the American Indians called Bdote, which was the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. And this was a very spiritual site for the Dakota, as they sort of believed that this was the location where the first humans were shaped and were formed. So it held a lot of significance for them. For the Europeans, they really saw it as a more sort of strategic location. They figured a fort at that location could sort of control the rivers, both the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers, high up on sort of a bluff overlooking the rivers themselves. It could potentially, stop anyone from getting through that they didn't want to, and also just in the region, it was a sort of location that they wanted. So, one of the early explorers, Zebulon Pike, sort of negotiates a deal with the Dakota to set up some sort of fort in the region. But there's a few problems with this. Zebulon Pike really had no authority to be negotiating this land deal or this land transfer. Eventually, when it does get into the Senate for debate, they essentially just start altering it to sort of fit their needs. They expand the size of what they were supposed to be given, and they determine the payment for it at about $2,000. Pike estimated the land was worth about $200,000, and they were offering $2,000. But they went ahead and began construction anyway. And these sort of dubious dealings around interactions between American Indians and the U.S. government, this is not really going to be anything new from what they sort of had been negotiating with other tribes and groups in the country. And this idea of making sort of an initial negotiation with an American Indian tribe, and then having the U.S. government tinker around with it and change it however they want before they approve it without any input from American Indian groups was very common. And definitely sort of showed how they were more than willing to alter the deals however they wanted to sort of fit their best interest. And then, of course, they had essentially the military on their side to sort of enforce those deals no matter of sort of how unfair or unjust they were. Construction on the Fort Hoover does begin in early 1820. It's completed by 1825. And once more, its main function was trying to control essentially trade in the region. They wanted to protect the fur trade, so make sure that there weren't going to be too many influx of Euro-American settlers before there's some sort of land transfer that took place. They also wanted to make sure that the British were going to stay the heck out of the territory and the region. And also they wanted to mediate sort of the relationship between the Dakota and the Ojibwe. In their estimation, things would be more profitable for them if they maintained sort of a peaceful relationship between the Dakota and the Ojibwe. And of course, the Dakota and the Ojibwe very much consider themselves different people and had been rivals and sometimes enemies for quite a long time up to this period. So trying to make sure that they were going to be able to sort of maintain a peaceful relationship between the two groups while they sort of got their profit was one of their main goals and objectives. And it's really the St. Peter's Indian Agency was kind of there to back up these various objectives. Essentially, the Indian agent was a civilian appointed by the President of the United States and served sort of as an ambassador to American Indian groups and nations living in the region. So trying to be kind of the official voice of the U.S. To those groups and to those nations. And once more, they're going to trying to be, keeping things as peaceful as possible so that the fur trade can progress and that sort of the United States can be as profitable as possible. And once it gets closer in time to when they want to start purchasing and buying and acquiring more land from American Indian groups, it's also going to be playing a part in sort of laying the groundwork for those land acquisitions. As time goes on, the sort of point of the Indian Agency is also going to turn much more towards acculturation and assimilation, and continually putting more and more pressure on American Indian groups to give up hunting, give up their religion, convert to Christianity, send their children to European-style education. And for the most part, the American Indian groups had no interest in any of this. They were very reluctant. They had been, surviving, themselves for thousands of years just fine before the Europeans showed up, and they had been profiting off of the fur trade for hundreds of years as well at this point in time. And really, it's only going to be when there's increased pressure and more land is going to be taken from them Um, and they are going to be essentially sequestered to these reservations, to smaller and smaller periods of land. And ironically, at that point in time, some of them begin to start trying to adopt more of the Euro-American traditions, but it's almost too late at that point because the reservations they're on aren't very well suited for agriculture and the kind of lifestyle that is sort of being forced upon them. And at that point in time, it's going to lead to a lot of problems, a lot of starvation, a lot of hunger, and there's going to be a real crisis in the American Indian community. And this is eventually going to be one of the reasons and one of the causes of the U.S. Dakota Wars we'll be talking about in a few weeks here. But it's important to note that this is also going to be sort of the mentality that the official U.S. government is going to be bringing into this and being conveyed by the Indian agencies, this idea of continually trying to pressure American Indians to abandon their traditions and adopt Euro-American traditions, even when it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for those American Indian groups to do that, and even when, to be quite honest, the U.S. government really wouldn't let them to a large degree. No matter how much American Indian groups did try to assimilate and acculturate, they were still going to be targeted by the government and by their policies, and it was going to continuously lead to problems, sort of regardless of how willing or not they were to try to engage in these kind of transitions of culture. More on that in the upcoming weeks, but it's interesting to note the sort of main objectives and reasons for sort of the first established sort of American presence in the state and how those were being operated out of the fort and the Indian Agency. All right, going on to look at our document exercise here. So question number one, what reasons does Nelson give for the expansion of the fur trade, and why did he decide to join and become a voyager? It's interesting. He actually has a fairly detailed perspective here of how sort of the war between European nations was sort of based upon economics at this point in time. There was these sort of wars of capital as the French were fighting the British and the British were fighting the Dutch and the Dutch were fighting the Spanish, and that certainly things like the fur trade were primarily meant to funnel and fuel these sort of competitions between these European nations that were all competing in the Americas, and that's one of the reasons why the fur trade, of course, becomes so profitable, is because they are essentially very much sending these materials and the furs back to Europe. France is using that to enrich themselves, and then they're essentially using that money to fight against their competitors. He sort of spells this out here with the first quote in the document. War about this period was raging with unwonted fury over the whole of Europe and carried to many other parts of the globe. The exertions of the nations had to make caused money to circulate abundantly and with a rapidity never perhaps known before. So interesting how he's making that connection. Another sort of thing that he takes note of is sort of the returning voyagers that he is observing. He's seeing them coming in with sort of high spirits and full of money that they're picking up for their service, and that they're sort of spending it as quickly as they're getting it, and certainly seems very appealing to a young man such as himself. The money, of course, is another big reason. He says that the company he's signing on with, they gave liberal salaries, which they paid the amount due with a punctuality and generosity that surprised and dazzled all. So he thought that even though he probably didn't quite know exactly what he was getting into, he certainly liked the idea of receiving that payment and money at the end of it. And finally, I think it's just sort of the idea of he wanted the adventure, right? He thought this could sort of be an adventurous lifestyle. He says, the example was infectious, and I was in that period of life remarkable for thoughtlessness and anxious to be engaged in busy life. I was seized with the delirium. And I think, anyone who's at that age, young or, a teenager or someone who's just sort of coming into their adult life, is going to be setting out to college or to a new job or a career. They've all probably sort of been in a time period where they could sort of qualify themselves in these terms. And anyone who's sort of gone out on a limb and did something just for the heck of it, there's sort of being seized by that idea, or as he says, by that delirium. So I like the way he sort of described his decision to join up. So looking at question number 2, what trials and tribulations does Nelson describe encountering? What attitudes does he seem to have when recounting these events? Yeah, I thought the class did a very good job of sort of depicting some of these complaints of pilfering, or complaints about the kind of food that he was engaging in, or that he was eating. Poor weather. For example, at one point he says, "I do not remember the date we left this place, but we had a great deal of wind and frequent cold rains and some dense fog." Living in sort of Minnesota now, we can certainly tell how cantankerous the weather can be. And if any of you have ever been up on the North Shore, the lake upon, or the land upon Lake Superior there, the weather can be very, very touchy and finicky up along those stretches, as well as other places along the Great Lakes. So you can certainly see how that would be a trial that would have to be overcome, and also some very dangerous elements. At one point he says it was awful to behold the immense size of the waves. And yeah, I mean, once more, if you've seen Lake Superior, you know that there can be some huge waves that almost as big as like ocean waves out there. And trying to think of being on that with a canoe, which would have been pretty decent size, but still a canoe loaded up with hundreds and hundreds and thousands of pounds of trade goods. Very very, very touchy. He talks about one of the people sort of falling over, and sort of all the problems that these big waves are causing, and that certainly must have been very scary at the time. I mean, I know if I was out there, I would have been petrified in a situation like that. And also, he describes sort of how a lot of people had died going down some of these rapids that they were encountering. So certainly showing that there's danger along the way as well. And of course, it's a somewhat sort of humorous account when he's talking about his time at Grand Portage, where someone ended up stealing the wine. They drilled holes into the wine vats, and they were trying to figure out who had done it. So he sort of offered up his Bible so that whoever was being accused could sort of swear on it. And he says he never got his Bible back. So sort of complaining about some of the unscrupulous people he was engaging with. I think you could pretty add on there as well. Yes, never a good thing when someone steals all the wine, especially with the voyageurs. You kind of get a sense from his account here. Don't mind a good drink or two along the way. Overall, though, through all this, he does maintain a pretty optimistic tone. He still sort of seems to consider everything more or less an adventure. And sometimes he might be in a little bit more danger than he is realizing. So on to question number 3. What additional information about the fur trade can this document reveal? And once more, I thought the class did a good job sort of looking at this and teasing some of these out. Some people focused on the relationships of the voyagers, how some of them got along better than others, and sort of what a tight-knit community they must have had. They liked that he sort of gave nicknames to the people that he was riding with, like the knight. Also, just a general sense of, what the Voyager life was like. How did they sleep? What did they eat? What were their, routines like? Someone pointed out sort of the ritual that they observed, where, the person was putting some tobacco and corn in the water to try to encourage better waves, and how some people sort of thought that was silly, but how he said in the end it sort of it seemed like it was working out. So sort of just a little ritual that they were sort of superstition that they were using to try to influence those sort of natural barriers that they were facing. What sort of trade routes were used? Where were they going, and where were they operating? So yeah, I thought everyone did a good job of sort of viewing and picking out the various ways that this document can tell us quite a bit about the fur trade, and certainly kind of an interesting anecdote about one person's sort of personal adventure through it.